Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to some more Star Wars lore. I've been wanting to do more of these, specifically the parts I really like about Star Wars lore, and the hyperdrive is one of them. And considering that scene in the latest Star Wars movie, The Last Jedi, this seemed like a perfect time to talk about it. Now, don't worry, there will be spoilers in the video, but they will be later on, and I will make it clear when they are going to be coming up. So, for now, let's just talk about what hyperspace and the hyperdrive actually is. First and foremost, let's talk about the concepts themselves, hyperspace and faster than light, because the franchise is a little bit confused on this. Frequently, you will see people referring to travel as faster-than-light travel, but what it in reality is hyperspace travel. The reason why it's frequently called faster than light is because, well, one, it is faster than light, but you only need a small moment of faster than light travel to enter hyperspace. This is also the reason why ships can do it at all the way they do, because of course in Star Wars, ships accelerate from virtually nothing to the speed of light like that, something that would rip any ship apart and turn it into fine space dust. And the reason why that doesn't happen is because in hyperspace, the usual laws of reality do not apply. It is a separate dimension from the real dimension. A bit of an immaterium, if you wish, except this one isn't populated by ravenous demonic monstrosities and gods. Instead, it is perhaps more accurately to call it a natural phenomenon. Which, well, technically chaos is as well, but let's not get into that here. So, what actually happens? Why is hyperspace travel faster than light travel? It achieves this speed by good old-fashioned cheating. Instead of traveling at a straight line from point A to B, which would be the fastest way of reaching any one spot in the galaxy during faster-than-light travel, hyperspace bends reality and space, which means that now point A and point B are closer together, because the space around those 2 points have been bent closer together. The hyperspace engine then continues to bend space as many times as it can, shortening the distance as much as it can, to the point where point A and B are as close as they can be, without the space overlapping. Apparently, hyperspace overlapping with real space is a very, very bad idea, apparently. Much like crossing a certain pair of beams, for example. You just don't do it because bad shit's going to happen. So, now that space has been folded, the ship needs to enter hyperspace, and it does so by briefly accelerating to the speed of light for a split second. This does not result in the disintegration of the ship, because it enters hyperspace that very same microsecond, and when in hyperspace, as mentioned, the usual laws of reality cease to apply. Specifically, the ship essentially becomes immaterial, despite the fact that it maintains all of its physical form as far as its occupants are concerned. Now, how exactly this happens? Well, science fiction mumbo-jumbo, essentially. But it is a thing that is possible within the Star Wars universe, not only through technology, but also, interestingly enough, through natural means. Because, you see, there exists a race of creatures that look like a bastard child of a whale and a octopus. Why the fuck not? Anyways, the important part is that these purgils have apparently been around for a very, very long time indeed. In fact, it would appear that they've been around for as long as people have been traveling in the galaxy at large, and everyone essentially got their hyperspace technology from these lovely little whale, octopus, space, fish, mammal things. Whatever they are, the important part is they are capable of traveling through hyperspace through some unknown means. However, they need a resource to do so, Closen-36, which is a gas that exists naturally in space. Once the purgils eat said gas, they are then able to enter hyperspace. And more so than the space whales themselves, this was the important discovery, because Clozone-36 can also be used by other creatures in the galaxy to craft engines, and essentially act as a fuel source for hyperspace travel. And of course, as soon as the early inhabitants of the galaxy figured that bit out, they knew that the gas allowed for hyperspace travel, therefore, all they had to do was continue to fiddle with the gas, until they figured out how to enter hyperspace. And as soon as the hard part was done, they could play around in the stars like they've always wanted to. Now, the timeline on this is a bit unclear. The only solid mention I have found is several millennia before the Cold War. Now, the Cold War refers to the, I was about to say, era of peace that came about after the death of the Emperor, but, well, not a whole lot actually changed. The supposed peace treaty seems to have done absolutely diddly-dick nothing, and the New Republic seems to also have done absolutely fucking nothing, so I really don't know what that was all about. And really, that's because nobody's really explored it yet. Or, well, we have in the alternative universe, but could we consider that canon anymore now? Considering that the movies are heading in a very, very different direction. That is a question I'll have to think about a little bit. Anyways, the timeline. So, millennia. So we're talking about thousands of years. I have seen a mention suggesting at least 3,000 to 4,000 years, but I would assume considerably more, considering the fact that the Star Wars galaxy is fairly large, some 400 billion stars. In comparison, our own galaxy is somewhere between 100 to 400, with the average being somewhere in the middle of 250, that being the official estimate. In other words, the Star Wars galaxy is almost twice the size of our own. And considering the sheer size, 4,000 years really isn't that much, considering you're going to have to explore a lot of it, and of course then spread the technology of hyperspace travel to everybody else. Now, how exactly this spread took place seems to be more or less glossed over. You would think that the species who had first invented hyperspace travel would hold on to it for dear fucking life, for obvious military reasons, but again, we don't know how long this period was. It could have been 4,000 years, it could have been 20,000 years. We don't really know. But let's return to the fuel source for a little bit, shall we? The Cluzon 36. So what do we know about Cluzon 36? Well, one, it is used by space whales to travel through hyperspace, and it is used by pretty much everybody else to travel through hyperspace as well, which obviously makes it a ridiculously valuable resource of huge strategic importance. In fact, I'm surprised that the space whales are still alive, because I can tell you this, if there existed a race of gigantic whale creatures on Earth that would eat oil, we'd murder those fuckers pretty goddamn quick. And obviously this means that access to these fuel sources would be very, very important during times of war. However, it might actually be less important than you might originally think, due to the fact that Cluzon 36 seems to be a very, very efficient fuel source. We have the example of the Phoenix Squadron capturing a shipment of Cluzon 36 and stating that that would be enough to run the entire squadron and their little fleet for one cycle being about 368 days, each day being 24 hours long. The question then becomes, how large was the Phoenix Squadron? This is a little bit difficult to answer because Star Wars is one of those universes that kinda makes up the numbers as it goes along. The newest movies are a perfect example of this, where they send their entire quote-unquote fleet to attack the Death Star planet. The fleet consists of about 12 X-Wings, and then, after having lost well over half their fleet, they return back home with 6 X-Wings. Interesting. And then, after that, of course, the rebels get attacked on their base planet in the next movie, at which point they have several more X-Wings, along with a wing of heavy bombers, which might have been useful attacking the Death Star. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to a frightening degree, but I'll use some of the more conservative estimates. So they had one squadron of fighters, A-wing fighters to be precise. Now these things are capable of faster than light travel, but in the name of fuel efficiency I'm going to assume that they would land on their transport aircraft. In addition to this, they had 5 corvettes and 2 frigates. along with some other smaller vehicles like a heavy fighter, combat transports, and stuff like that, but I'm going to be assuming that those will be docking with the larger ships wherever possible. Now, yes, they did have some heavy transport, which would probably travel by themselves, but let's just make the numbers easy, shall we, and say 5 corvettes and 2 frigates. Though, honestly, I'm hesitant to call them frigates and corvettes. These are pretty damn tiny ships, between 100 to 300 meters long, which in 40k sense would practically make them heavy fighters, but hey, details. So, then comes the question, how large is a shipment? Well, most light transports within the Star Wars universe can carry somewhere between 50 to 500 tons. Unless we're talking about a capital transport, in which case we'd probably know about it. So for sake of argument, let's assume the largest number, 500 tons. So first we'll take 500 and divide it on the number of days, 368, which leaves us with about 1.35 tons. Then we divide that on the number of ships, that being 5, which leaves us with about 270 kilograms of fuel per ship per day. Now, of course, I am simplifying this a fair bit by turning a gas into a weight measurement, whilst what we really should be talking about is, of course, density. However, in this case, it is simply easier to assume that a transport ship that can carry 500 tons could carry 500 tons equivalent of gas. If anything, I am vastly overstating the amount of fuel the rebels actually had with those 500 tons. And I'm doing that simply because I have no way of measuring the density of Cluzon, because, well, it doesn't exist. I can't try dissolving it in water and measuring the mass. I can't freeze it and then simply weigh it, and I can't measure the speed of sound passing through it, so we're simply going to assume that 500 tons equal 500 tons of fuel. Which returns us to the 270 kilograms of fuel, and that might sound like a lot, but it's absolutely dick all considering the distances travelled. For example, a modern-day destroyer, an actual boat, might spend something along the lines of 3,000 litres of fuel per hour travelled, and that wouldn't be a particularly long distance. In the meantime, these ships can jump for several light years distance and burn 270 kilograms a day. That is absolutely insane. And of course, this is by no means a hard estimate. The Phoenix Squadron might have a year where they don't enter hyperspace as often, etc., etc. There are many variables. But nevertheless, this is a very small amount of fuel. And in return, the efficiency of said fuel source means that having access to a steady stream of said fuel is not as important. If, for example, a certain rebellion would build up a strategic reserve of a few 100 million tons, they could fuel a lot of starships for a ludicrous amount of time. And that is far from impossible. Compared, for example, to the strategic petroleum reserves in the United States, it holds somewhere along the lines of 700 million barrels, which converts quite neatly to circa 115 billion litres of oil. So yes, keeping a strategic reserve like that on a galactic scale should be pretty goddamn simple. And considering the apparent average size of their fleets, it should be practically trivial. And this in return explains why Star Wars isn't seemingly as focused around the conquest of resources, because one of the most important resources is also really easy to stockpile and extract in large quantities. And again, have I said this already, but this is what I really like about hyperspace in Star Wars, because when you extrapolate this to the logical conclusions, it still actually makes sense. I was actually thinking this when I started making this video. Why isn't this the most important thing in the galaxy? Why doesn't people just simply win by controlling access to this particular resource, since any side that does not have access to this resource would be completely incapable of contesting the other side's dominance of the galaxy? And well, the reason is that even a fairly small stockpile can run several ships for a ridiculous amount of time. I like hyperspace. So, now that we talked about the fuel source, let's talk about the actual mode of travel itself, hyperspace. As I mentioned at the beginning, once a ship enters hyperspace, it ceases to obey some basic rules of the physical universe, the most important one being the fact that the ship becomes immaterial, somehow without murdering everybody on board. This means that the ship can pass through the material universe without colliding with shit, and this is very, very important. Because, as mentioned, the universe is full of all kinds of debris: rocks, asteroids, suns, planets, other ships, and floating space whales. If a ship were to travel through the galaxy at light speed, without being immaterial, that would be ridiculously risky, as even if there was a tiny fucking pebble in the way, that pebble would strike your ship at the speed of light, and would rip a gargantuan fucking hole in said ship. And let's not even begin discussing the various structural integrity problems that start arising once an object is traveling at the speed of light. And of course, this whole problem with bumping into things becomes infinitely more complex when there's also a ton of other things traveling at the speed of light. Now, maybe you could maneuver at the speed of light. It would be difficult, and predicting the location of every single rock in the galaxy would, well, essentially be impossible, but at least you could maybe make the argument that they could potentially do so through some kind of supercomputer mumbo-jumbo. But when the entire galaxy is swipping and swooping left and right across the galaxy, odds are pretty damn good that Person A and Person B are going to hit each other at considerable speeds. The good part is that nobody would ever know, because they would atomize each other to the point that they would just create wonderful little space debris, which other ships would then run into and explode, and so on and so on. It'd be a very bad idea, basically. But in hyperspace, everyone is traveling at essentially the same speed. They are, however, and this is important to point out, still occupying the same space, which means that if a ship hits another ship in hyperspace, that would be a collision and bad things would happen. In fact, it was apparently possible to transfer civilians, passengers, and cargo between ships in hyperspace, although doing so was considered exceedingly dangerous. This means that the threat of collision is considerably smaller, although a certain species of space whale that also travels in hyperspace does have a nasty habit of slamming into ships because, well, clearly they don't know any better, being massive space whales and stuff. For increased safety, there are also designated hyperspace lanes that lead into particularly heavily trafficked systems, because again, collisions in hyperspace would be a bad thing, considering that they are currently in an immaterial state, and, well, crashing into something else that is also in an immaterial state, the consequences could quickly escalate, shall we say. However, most of the galaxy, you just go wherever the hell you want. Again, since you are able to see other ships and you are traveling at relatively the same speed, you should be able to avoid them. And I'm assuming most ships have some way of doing so automatically, since, again, I've pretty much never seen anybody actually maneuver in hyperspace. I don't even know if it's possible to do any kind of large-scale maneuvers. I assume minor adjustments are possible, because otherwise I can't possibly see how you would be able to transfer cargo at any point, which has been mentioned, but perhaps only in very specific circumstances. For example, maybe two ships can go closer while they're on the same path or something like that. Basically, the physics of hyperspace travel is unclear, to put it mildly, and it has been made even more unclear by The Last Jedi, and yes, this is where we're going to be getting into spoiler territory, so if you still have not seen the Mary Sue, then you should leave now. But, well, the Mary Sue wins. That wasn't even really a spoiler, that was just, the literal title of the fucking movie. Anyways, I have procrastinated enough for those who did not wish to hear what comes up next to have diddled off, so hyperspace in the latest movies. Well, first and foremost, the Empire is now apparently capable of tracking ships through hyperspace. Now, this would be a ludicrously difficult thing, because the ship that would be tracking would still be in material space, while the ship that it is tracking is now essentially in another dimension and moving at the speed of light. It would be problematic to follow that with any kind of accuracy. What they could potentially do, I guess, is find the rough direction in which the enemy fleet was pointing, and then extrapolate based upon whatever degree of maneuver you can do in hyperspace to a rough quadrant of space. But we are still talking about, well, billions upon billions of kilometers of space, so not exactly what I would consider to be accurate. But again, as long as it is internally consistent with the universe and this kind of tracking systems always work the same way, then fuck it, that's just how it works. I do find it rather interesting that nobody has come up with this technology before, and yet some random Asian woman immediately figures out not only how it works, but apparently that they have installed it on every single ship these days, to be baffling, to put it mildly. But anyways, they can now track the rebel fleet through hyperspace. That is rather interesting. Additionally, apparently, the rebel fleet now is running out of fuel. But the hyperspace fuel is the gas. Do they also utilize the gas for their sublight engines? I have to assume they do. Now this again becomes very, very interesting because of course, if you are continuously accelerating in space, you are continuously increasing speed. In this case, it makes sense due to the fact that it's a chase scene, and both sides would be burning their engines as fast as they can to keep up with one another. Even so, if the Rebel fleet is only slightly faster than the Imperial fleet, due to the fact that it will be accelerating faster, it should be gaining a pretty severe speed advantage on the Imperial fleet. Should, but hey, again, details. What this really brings up, though, is the fact that some of these ships are capable of interatmospheric flight. In fact, Imperial Star Destroyers was seen in the previous movie hovering a couple hundred meters above a city. Now, the sheer amount of energy that would be required to keep a ship of that size and weight floating within an atmosphere has got to be absolutely hilarious. And again, let me give you an example from the real world. And I keep doing this because most of Star Wars seems to be similar to our world. For example, there is gravity. Gravity seems to be roughly the equivalent of Earth, etc., etc., which means that the energy required to tear oneself free from a planet with roughly the same gravity as Earth would be roughly similar. Obviously, again, there would be deviations based upon the thickness of the atmosphere, yada 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 yada, but again, it's a rough similarity. So, you know those booster rockets we use to send shit into space? Those burn something along the lines of 6 tons of solid propellant every single second. And that's just to put something the size of a space shuttle in orbit. To keep something like a Star Destroyer afloat perfectly still, with its engines apparently idling, holy hell, it would require an absolutely obscene amount of energy. In fact, it would probably require a hell of a lot more energy than simply running the engines. Now, again, how exactly this would work, I haven't the faintest clue. The math is hard to get to work out in that particular circumstance, but again, as long as the universe is internally consistent, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with the Star Destroyer idling above a city, as long as it can always do that. But now, however, the Rebel fleet is running out of fuel during sublight drives, and they'll run entirely dry in 18 hours. And I cannot imagine a scenario in which burning their engines at full burn for 18 hours could possibly consume more energy than idling within a planet's atmosphere. Granted, these were smaller ships, but still, it's a pretty severe inconsistency right there. And inconsistency really is the word that needs to be used for the 2 latest Star Wars movies. Up until this point, hyperspace, faster-than-light travel, etc., and how it worked had remained remarkably internally consistent. Yes, Han Solo pulled off some bullshit here and there, like in the first movie, the first of the new movies, where he took off from a docked position inside of a ship directly into hyperspace, but that could actually be possible. Because again, at the very same instant that the ship accelerates to light speed, it also enters into this separate dimension, which means that it could technically fly right through a barred gate, for example, without colliding with said gate, because it would now be an immaterial object. It's not something I would test for myself anytime soon, but it could be possible. And the same reason can also be used to explain why accelerating to hyperspace while still within the atmosphere of a planet is possible. Again, accelerating to that kind of speed while inside an atmosphere would be suicidal, because you would have all the drag of the planet's atmosphere in addition to the acceleration weighing down on the ship. Essentially, if this would be suicide in space, which it would be 15 times as much suicide in an atmosphere. But since the ship leaves the dimension in which those rules apply in the very same instant that it actually accelerates to light speed, it doesn't actually matter. Or, at the very least, that is how it used to function, before Vice Admiral Holdo decided to utterly and irrevertibly fuck Star Wars canon into tiny little screaming pieces. And sadly, this is what happens when you let somebody who doesn't actually know about a universe, and doesn't actually care about a universe, create media concerning said universe. Because they simply don't understand how the universe functions. And even if they do, they mostly just don't actually give a shit. If they understood how hyperspace worked in Star Wars, they would never have done this. And the reason they would never have done this is because of the obvious implications that this immediately raises. Because if you're going to let somebody crash their ship through other ships using hyperspace, that means that you've disproven one of the core tenets of hyperspace, namely that it makes your ship immaterial. And with that break in lore, the entire concept of faster than light travel in Star Wars just disintegrates. This is one of those lore changes that is actually severely damaging to the core universe, and it makes it all look stupid and ill-conceived, when actually, in the case of hyperspace, it was pretty goddamn well conceived. For example, that time in Rebel 1 when they entered hyperspace in a planet's atmosphere. If the ship actually remains material for a period of time, that could not happen. Or another example in the first Mary Sue movie, when Han Solo enters hyperspace from inside the hangar of a larger freighter. That maneuver should have resulted in the Millennium Falcon creating a very large hole in the rear portion of said freighter, along with disintegrating the Millennium Falcon. And again, as I mentioned, when we're talking about faster than light travel, it is very problematic from a structural integrity standpoint. Entering the speed of light in a physical object is going to put a pretty goddamn severe strain on said physical object. And here's the thing. A lot of people think that there's no gravity in space. This is false. This is the concept of microgravity. Basically, every single star, every single planet, etc. has gravity. And that gravity extends in a microscopic fashion out across the entirety of space. Which means that even in the deep darkness of space, there is gravity. In fact, this is how galaxies are formed to begin with. For example, at the heart of basically every single massive galaxy we know of, there is a supermassive black hole, which, by the way, means that the planet Earth is eventually doomed to plunge into a supermassive black hole. But don't worry, our sun is going to go out long before that, so it's fine. Anyways, let's return to the concept of microgravity. If there is gravity, although it is of course super weak, there is also a problem with accelerating ridiculously quickly because you will be fighting against gravity. And the faster you accelerate, the more the gravity will wear upon an object. Now, there are objects in the galaxy traveling at close to light speed. But they've been accelerating for a very long time indeed. Taking an object from, well, a few hundred kilometers to the speed of light in a second would, as previously mentioned, turn said object into a very fine sort of space powder. It really is quite remarkable, but with this one bullshit scene, they have completely ruined an integral part of Star Wars lore. Now, hyperspace doesn't make sense within the rules of the universe anymore. It's no longer internally consistent because all other times it's done one thing, and now suddenly, because a purple-haired feminist is in the seat, it does a completely another thing. Not to mention, of course, all of the other implications. If this is actually how lightspeed works in Star Wars, why hasn't anybody fucking weaponized this bullshit? I mean, you have lightspeed engines on fighters. Take a fighter, turn it into what is essentially a very large torpedo, and replace the fighter part with the densest material you know of, let's take for example tungsten, and then mount a hyperspace engine on the back of it. Voila! You have a weapon that would cost virtually nothing to produce that could destroy any capital ship in the fucking galaxy. In fact, this bullshit screw-up of Star Wars lore has made everything suspect. In Star Wars, bigger ships are more powerful. The Death Star is the most powerful thing they have. The Death Planet is the even more powerful thing they have. Because Star Wars. But with this new type of hyperspace, none of that matters anymore. The Rebels didn't have to hit a weakness to destroy the first Death Star. All they would have to do is take a frigate and ram the Death Star. Problem solved. The giant death planet? Okay, take maybe 2 frigates to make really sure, and again, you're done. You want to take out a super star destroyer? Take a fighter, and whip, boom, that's it. It has completely invalidated every single fucking ounce of space lore within Star Wars. The sheer destructive potential of this new weapon would only be rivaled by the SJW's capabilities of annihilating once beloved franchises. What it took decades to build, what created an entire movie series, countless TV shows, dozens of books, a huge fandom, and built an entire sci-fi universe, the feminists managed to tear apart in a single fucking scene. If it wasn't so incredibly disappointing and just disheartening, I'd almost be impressed. And this comes from somebody who doesn't even like Star Wars that much? I mean, I would not, by any stretch of the imagination, describe myself as a huge Star Wars fan, and even I just am sad and depressed at what they did to it. Sure, yeah, the previous Star Wars movies could be hammy, the TV shows could be as well, but there was a core of real brilliance in there, and now I see that core shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and I don't think it'll be long before there will be very little left. What they did to hyperspace, they're eventually going to do to something else. They're going to try and be smart, and they're going to fuck something up. You remember all of the nonsense that came around the midichlorians? Well, this is basically the midichlorians on steroids, and I don't imagine it's going to be stopping anytime soon. And the fact that it happened to hyperspace, probably one of my favourite things within Star Wars, is even more annoying. Sigh. I do wonder if they're ever going to address that ever again, if they're going to go like, oh, well, after this, the Rebellion invented an entirely new kind of weapon, and that's how they're going to stage their comeback. Might be useful, considering that after the last Mary Sue, the Rebellion is essentially defeated and utterly destroyed. I mean, how many survivors were there at the end? However many you could squeeze into the Millennium Falcon, basically. And it's not that big of a ship, what? 30, 40 members still live of the original Resistance? That's, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad indeed. And you know the really funny part is, once the far left gets a hold of the movie, not only do they start fucking over the law, but the good guys start losing. Badly. It would almost be funny if it wasn't so damn tragic. And with that, let's wrap up the movie. I just want to say once again, hyperspace really was one of my favourite things about Star Wars, and a big part of that is that it has remained mostly internally consistent within the universe. At the very least, the violations of it that has happened have been relatively minor, not like that scene. But still, it's a really cool thing, it's well thought out, and the story behind it makes mostly sense, which is really awesome to see for once. Now, having made one positive video and one negative video, I'm thinking the next one should probably be a complaint video again. Maybe I'll talk about lightsabers, because God knows those things make abso-fucking-lutely no goddamn sense. We'll have to see. I'm thinking I'll be returning to 40k and Warhammer for at least a couple more videos, so until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.